Thanks, Michal. So I'm going to talk about why languages are the way they are. So there's more than 7,000 languages in the world today, and they're different in many ways. You probably realized some of these differences when you were studying foreign languages. And one way in which languages differ is in terms of which meanings they lexicalize, so which meanings they pack into small expressions. Let's take an example of numbers 6 to 9. Many languages, such as English, lexicalize these numbers, meaning that in English, in English we have these simple expressions to refer to these numbers. While many other languages, such as Fulfulde, which is a language spoken in Western Africa, in this green area here, so languages such as Fulfulde construct expressions from these numbers, from smaller expressions which carry meaning. And these expressions are called morphemes. So in Fulfulde, we have 3 morphemes. In, for example, expression for 6, we have morpheme for 5, for plus, and for 1. So Fulfulde builds expression for 6 as 5 plus 1, expression for 7 as 5 plus 2, and so on. Now, despite these immense differences among languages, there's also many interesting similarities. So if we stick to the domain of which meanings are lexicalized in the semantic domain of number, many languages which differ, so many languages which are not historically or geographically related, lexicalize numbers 1, 2, 3, 10, and 100. So in English, as in Fulfulde, these expressions have one morpheme, so they're lexicalized. Now, a question I'm interested in is what explains the similarities and differences across languages? So why are languages the way they are? And then because the capacity to acquire and use language is such a fundamental capacity that we have, I'm also interested in whether studying similarities and differences across languages can teach us something about how human cognitive capacities emerge more generally. Now, the hypothesis I'm exploring is that languages are evolving like living organisms, and that they are adapting to certain pressures. Now, under this hypothesis, we see similarities across languages. So we can compare the similarities across languages to cases where the same feature occurs independently in different organisms throughout evolution. So for instance, birds and butterflies independently evolved wings, presumably because it's very useful to have wings. Under this hypothesis, we can think of differences across languages and compare them to organisms devolving essentially different ways to deal with the same pressure. So for instance, to deal with the pressure to not be eaten, frogs can either be red and look poisonous, or be green and blend into their environment. So there's different ways that an organism can respond to the same pressure. And yeah, I'm trying to think about similarities and differences across languages in these ways. And the research questions I'm asking is what pressures a language is adapting to? So what is equivalent of, for example, don't be eaten for frogs, but for languages? And to what extent these pressures can explain similarities and differences that we see across languages, particularly in the contents of languages' lexicons, so in terms of which meanings are lexicalized. Okay, I'm now going to present you a case study I did on number expressions, so expressions that we use to refer to numbers, in which I tried to study which meanings are lexicalized across languages in the semantic domain of number, and what pressures may explain them. Okay, so I proposed within this case study that when it comes to lexicons of natural languages, they are under 2 competing pressures. The first pressure is a cognitive pressure, and it's a pressure to not overload memory, which for the domain of lexicon translates into minimize the number of items in the lexicon, so minimize the number of morphemes in the lexicon. The second pressure is a communication pressure, which is to produce simple expressions, so to produce expressions with as few morphemes as possible. Now, these 2 pressures are competing, so they're pulling in different directions. And to see this, you can imagine a language. You can imagine a language like the one illustrated on the left, which lexicalizes only one word, so only one number. So it has an expression for number 1 as a lexical item. So it's great on the not overloading memory side. It has a very small lexicon, but then if we want to communicate with this language, we have to build very complex expressions. So for instance, if we want to talk about the number 3 in this language, we would have to say something like 1 plus 1 plus 1. If we want to talk about number 57, we have to say something like 1 plus 1 plus 1, and so with 57 ones. On the other hand, if we have a language which enables us to talk about many, many numbers with simple expressions, that's going to be great on the second pressure, but is going to overburden our memory a lot. So we can imagine a language in which we have, for example, even expression like a morpheme for number 57. So these two pressures are pulling in opposite direction, and now how our language is solving these two. So I'm hypothesizing that languages are actually optimizing the trade-off between these two pressures. So they need to find a way to trade off between them, and I'm hypothesizing that they find an optimal way to do that. Now I'm going to tell you about how I evaluate this proposal empirically. So I simulate language evolution over many generations and then find optimal solutions to this trade-off problem. And then I look at how close natural languages are to this set of optimal solutions. Now, in order to simulate evolution, I need to generate many artificial languages. And artificial languages, for my purposes, are essentially a set of lexical items for number meanings. So we can look at this example here. So we can imagine a language which has 3 lexical items for number 1, for 2, and for 5. And then it contains a set of number expressions for numbers between 1 and 99 that are composed from these building blocks, so from these lexical items. So for instance, in this language, the expression for number 1 is going to have just one morpheme, same for expression for number 2, but then expression for number 3 is going to be composed as 1 plus 2, expression for number 4 is 2 plus 2, and so on. So I generate many, many such languages, and they can be plotted per their lexicon size and the average number of morphemes in their number expressions. So here I plotted first 2 extremes. So on the left extreme here, there is a language which has very low lexicon size. So lexicon size is on the x-axis, but it has very high average number of morphemes. So it's very high on the y-axis. So this is an example of a language which has very small lexicon, but then to communicate with that language, you need complex expressions. And the other extreme is this language here, which has very high lexicon size and very low average number of morphemes. So on the communication side, it's very good, but on the lexicon size, it's very bad. Now, as I said before, I simulated evolution over 100 generations. Each generation had 2,000 languages. And the idea is that each generation is a little bit better and better in trading off between lexicon size and average number of morphemes. And the languages from that simulation are plotted here as these green triangles. And then once I do that, I find the optimal solutions to the problem of trading off between lexicon size and average number of morphemes. So the set of optimal solutions are essentially those languages for which there is no other language which is better on one dimension without being worse on the other. So for instance, there's no other language that has lower lexicon size without having higher average number of morphemes, or vice versa. And so this set of optimal solutions, called the Pareto frontier, is this black curve plotted here. Okay, so the next thing I did to evaluate empirically whether indeed natural languages are optimal solutions to this trade-off problem is that I studied 128 languages, and for each of these languages, I computed their lexicon size, again, for the semantic domain of numbers, and the average number of morphemes in their number expressions. And these natural languages are plotted as red circles here. And as you can see, they're all very close to this Pareto frontier. So they're all very close to being optimal solutions to the problem of trading off between lexicon size and average number of morphemes. So this shows that, indeed, similarities and differences that we find in the lexicons of natural languages when it comes to number expressions can be explained by languages essentially trying to find a good way to trade off between these two pressures, to trade off between lexicon size and average number of morphemes. And so this case study illustrates more generally how we can essentially look at how cognitive capacities emerge, so why they are the way they are. And in particular, for the case of languages, we see that they seem to be evolving towards optimal solutions to multiple cognitive and communicative pressures, and this explains many similarities and differences that we find across languages. Okay, thank you. Questions?
Thank you, Milica.
Thanks. It's Alex from Tel Aviv University. So you said that there's an evolution of languages towards finding an optimal solution in terms of these two constraints. I was wondering if there's a case of regression, so a case where language actually becomes worse in terms of these two constraints. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. So to study that, one would have to look at essentially in the individual languages and look at historical data. So this is very recent work that I did. So I haven't really looked. So this is synchronic data. So these are data from languages the way they are spoken today. So in order to address your question, one would have to take a particular language and look how its expressions for number meanings evolved. So definitely it would be interesting to see what happens. I think the general prediction is that if languages are evolving towards optimality, you shouldn't see that often. I mean, you may see that sometimes it could happen as a consequence of some random event in language's history, like maybe a contact with another language which has a very different system or something like that. But the expectation is that most languages, if you look really at this kind of historical trajectory, so historical data for each language, the prediction of let's say this approach more generally is that most of them are going to be heading towards optimality.
So Tel Aviv University, really interesting. Kind of building upon the previous question. So if you were to plot these languages according to how long they've been spoken, do you expect that to have a trend? Because I'm thinking of Hebrew. Hebrew is a relatively modern language, spoken Hebrew, and it has less words than the equivalent, let's say English. So I wonder if your thought is regarding if we're kind of building upon the previous question, would you see a trend with the age of the language?
Okay, thanks. So Yara's question is about whether we can see languages which are spoken longer essentially being closer to optimality. So again, I haven't looked at that. It's actually a really, really interesting suggestion. But the prediction is that in principle, yes, especially because one of the pressure is coming particularly from the communication side. So the prediction is that the longer the language is spoken, the more there's going to be the exertion of this pressure from communication, and that you will see that language is getting closer and closer to optimality. So indeed, the prediction is that the longer the language, that we should see this trend, that the longer the language is spoken, the closer it should be to optimality. Yeah, thanks for the suggestion. It's actually really cool.
So Carlos from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I'm going to ask a slightly politically incorrect question. Now, I've seen this curve, the Pareto curves, indicating that most languages that are currently spoken tend to optimality. But is it the case of all languages that are currently spoken? And do you have any examples that deviate a little bit from this optimality?
So this is a corpus of 128 languages, so definitely not all languages that are currently spoken. And so you have to take a sample, it's just not feasible to study all languages. And the way the sample is taken, so I took essentially a list of languages, so a sample of languages from a resource that's called World Atlas of Language Structures. And they compiled their sample with an eye towards geographic and historical, so geographic diversity and historical relatedness. So these languages, it's a very diverse set of languages, so they're definitely not all, for example, Indo-European or anything like that. So they're very diverse. So that kind of gives us some confidence that this is representative of world's languages. But of course, as in general, you study a sample and then you try to make a generalization. The hope is that the sample is representative. So in this sample, there were no languages which kind of deviated a lot from this, so you can see that they're all very close. But it could happen that if the sample is enlarged, we may find some deviations, and then it would be interesting to figure out why we see these deviations. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for this very nice talk. I have a question about this study that you showed here, because you show how the language find the optimization between the number of morphemes and lexicon size, and some of them fall like all close to the curve, but some get higher number of morphemes to have a smaller lexicon size. And that you did for numbers. Do you expect that when you do it for other things like names for family relationships and these basic structures that you normally check in languages, do you expect that the languages that prioritize either the morphemes or the lexicon size for numbers will follow the same patterns for other analysis, or do you expect it to be random, that some of them will follow one pattern for one group and
Okay,
another one?
thanks. So Eduardo is asking about whether, so what do we expect to happen when we move this particular analysis that was done for number expressions to other semantic domains, and in particular whether we are going to see, let's say, the same kind of positionment on the Pareto frontier for the same language but for different semantic domains. So let me talk about two things separately. So definitely is the case that this kind of analysis, so this is a case study, and the idea is that these pressures are kind of exerting their influence in other semantic domains as well. And actually, domain of kinship terms, so family relations, is an excellent domain to study this. So indeed, the prediction of this is that for kinship terms, we should see something similar. Whether this, so this model essentially doesn't tell you anything about like why one language is on this part of Pareto frontier and why another language is on this other part of Pareto frontier. It's only telling you languages are optimizing this trade-off. You know, there's different ways to solve this problem. So there's different optimal ways to solve this problem, and then just one language kind of drifts towards one way and the other drifts towards another way. So like I don't have an explanation for why specific languages are exactly where they are on the Pareto frontier. And I wouldn't at this point make a prediction that the same language would be on the similar part of Pareto frontier for another semantic domain, precisely because I don't know yet. It's an interesting thing to figure out. I don't know yet whether there is, like, what is there to say about why languages choose specific points of Pareto frontier. Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Yeah.
To continue this conversation, there's some work on color naming schemes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, by Noga Zaslavsky. So, and they follow the information bottleneck principle. So is it the same kind of measure? Is it different? What's your take on all this line of work?
Yeah. So there's a lot of work I also did some work on essentially there was a different take on what lexicons are optimizing. So a different take on what they're optimizing is that they're optimizing a trade-off between the complexity of the lexicon and the amount of information that you can communicate with elements of your lexicon. So in particular for color terms, the idea was that you kind of try to figure out a good way to communicate. So to not lexicalize too many color terms, but to kind of convey as correctly as possible the color that you want to have in mind. And so Noga Zaslavsky's work, as well as some previous work that I did, is in that paradigm. So it's essentially two different pressures. Now, when I started doing this work, I realized that this model is just not enough. So this is called simplicity informativeness trade-off model. It's not enough because we have syntax that allows us to compose expressions and to communicate meanings that we don't lexicalize. And so when you take syntax into account, for many semantic domains, such as numbers, kinship terms, and so on, this model just, conceptually it doesn't make sense, because the way we communicate meanings in those domains is with syntactically complex expressions. So it cannot be that what languages are doing is kind of trying to solve that particular trade-off problem. So that's why essentially this kind of work is a big kind of, like I'm trying to respond to this previous work that some people did, including me, and try to kind of like broaden where we're going with this. So there is this other pressure, like, minimize the length or like minimize the average number of morphemes in your expressions, that this line of work has forgotten, like, not thought about. And essentially it's kind of showing that we need this other pressure, and perhaps an even more accurate model for some future studies would be like a three-dimensional model when you look at, lexicon size, average number of morphemes, and informativeness. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Slava from Weizmann. I wonder, do you have any comment on lexicon size and number of morphemes versus brain development, how children count?
So let me check whether I understood. So like whether there is any correlation between how languages are.
How does brain development affect lexicon size and number of morphemes? How would a child count comparing to how would a fully grown adult with developed language count?
Okay, thank you. So the question is whether, like what is out there in terms of like how, let's say, our number expressions develop. So there is a lot of work in terms of how kids learn to count. So yeah, we know in particular, like they have periods in which they only know the word 1, and then they learn the word 2, and then they learn the word 3, and then they kind of make this huge inductive leap when they, even though they've heard these expressions, 4, 5, and so on, they didn't know what they mean, and then they suddenly kind of figure out meanings for all these numbers. So there is a lot of work on that. So far, I haven't really thought about any way to connect that work with this work, because in the studies of how kids learn to count, it's really about development within an individual. While this work is at the system level. So like why are systems the way they are? But what could be interesting is to maybe look at whether there's any interesting things happening with different kinds of number systems and language development. We can continue this discussion. Like I don't have ideas exactly what to look at there, but I'm happy to keep talking about that afterwards.
Thank you very much, Milica.
Thank you.